Let me just say it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be connecting and having this conversation, this type of conversation about consciousness and survival of consciousness beyond death and nature of reality. I mean, what bigger, more important questions could we possibly be asking? You know, yeah, so my name is Jonas. I professionally am currently working in the field of mental health and specifically in the niche of psychedelic assisted therapy. So over the past 5 years, I've been working at a legal therapeutic retreat center that's based in Jamaica, where psilocybin mushrooms and other plant-based psychedelic substances are legal. So yeah, I work at this retreat center. People attend these retreats for a whole variety of different reasons, but mostly to address mild to severe cases of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, trauma, PTSD, things like this. And, we see just absolutely incredible outcomes, profoundly transformative experiences through psychedelic substances in conjunction with a safe and supportive setting and an abundance of therapeutic support before, during, and after the experience. And, you know, um, I have to largely credit my own exploration of meditation in combination with psychedelic substances for my interest in the topics of consciousness and research into near-death experiences and parapsychological phenomenon and past life memories and remote viewing and a whole different host of topics. It's interesting that in the modern Western world, the kind of predominantly the discussion around psychedelics is largely a mental health or a therapeutic one, right? The efficacy of psilocybin in treating, major depressive disorder, something along these lines. And to be sure, the potential here is truly revolutionary. I mean, psychedelics, I believe, will completely continue to completely revolutionize the future of mental health. And at the same time, that's just the beginning. That's just the beginning of the potential here because very consistently, and this is visible in modern clinical research, these substances potentiate or open up experiences that are described as peak spiritual experiences, right? What are often called mystical experiences that tap into domains of experience and the human condition that are far beyond just a discussion of mental health and really go into these realms of what is the nature of self? What is the nature of mind and consciousness and reality itself? Is there more to the mystery than what we can perceive with our physical senses? Is there more to what we are than this one physical body and brain? And um, can stop me if I'm rambling here, Darren, but it was really, I mean, for the first almost 20 years of my life, I was a pretty hardcore atheist and materialist. And I really had absolutely no belief in anything beyond the physical. And for me, it was absolutely certain for me, yeah, that consciousness is produced by the complex interaction of neurons in the brain. There's nothing more to what I am than this body. When I die, that's it, period. Um, it's obvious. Through my initial, uh, just kind of, I really wasn't seeking out psychedelics. I was kind of taught to fear these substances, but kind of serendipitously crossed my path. A friend offered me to join in an experience with a couple other people, and without any intention of having a profound experience, I really did. Um, it was, it's hard to put it into words, even, over 10 years later, I've thought a lot about it, but I would describe this experience as really a re-enchantment for me of the mystery of life. I thought I knew things. I thought I understood things. And in that experience, I was just overwhelmed with this sense of awe and wonder, like a direct, visceral sense of the miraculous and mysterious quality of all of this. All the seemingly mundane things of like a bird flying in the sky or the trees swaying in the wind or the clouds floating by. I was staring at a blade of grass for what felt like an eternity. and just like absolutely dumbfounded by the elegance, the mysteriousness, the complexity, the beauty, the harmony of the natural world. And I had this really powerful experience of like my feeling my heart beating in my chest. And I had this like sudden, like this moment of revelation where I realized in this moment, there is absolutely nothing that I'm doing. There's no effort that I'm exerting. There's no intellectual understanding that's making my heart beat. It's just happening. And it was this sense of like, over the past 13.8 whatever billion years of the evolution of this universe, life has just self-organized into this. And there's this quality of life emergence. All of a sudden, it was imbued with this incredible sense of what I could now only really call the sacred, you know? And it was such an intellectually humbling experience. It opened my mind to the possibility that everything I think is true is absolutely wrong. I don't know the first damn thing. I don't even know who I am. And that led to this path of exploration and discovery where I began, just reading about different psychedelic substances. And one in particular is named NN-DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And a famous book was written a couple years ago called DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And just in reading the literature around this, before even having any of my own experience with this, I was just like obsessively researching this topic for over a year. And consistently, all of these people who, these research participants were describing experiences that are remarkably similar and analogous to descriptions of near-death experiences. There are important differences, but people, consistently and reliably in these DMT trials were describing a subjective sense of consciousness or awareness separating from the physical body, right? Kind of moving a sense of movement or motion beyond the physical realm, a sense of transcendence of space and time altogether, a sense of breaking through or emerging or arriving in some sort of alternate plane or realm or dimension of existence beyond this physical universe, encountering beings, seemingly sentient entities there, a sense of visceral, like this noetic sense of like something viscerally true. This isn't just a hallucination. This feels way more real than anything I've ever experienced. Doesn't feel like a hallucination. It feels like a revelation of fundamental truth, right? And then a sense of kind of um, intuitive gain of knowledge, of insight, of wisdom, and then kind of like a return back into this physical body, into this physical form with profoundly transformative effects that change our entire lives forever, right? And so just reading about this stuff and researching, like, it was so unbelievably fascinating to me and suggested kind of like an intersection of science and spirituality because this is exactly what mystics have been saying for thousands of years, is that there's more to reality, that there's more to what we are than the physical, that there's more beyond and anything that we can perceive with our physical senses. And here I was encountering body of scientific data and evidence that was lending credence and validity to those claims. And so that exploration led me towards a really like a kind of burning passion to engage with this work and with this space, and specifically in a therapeutic sense that tries to help people grow and heal and kind of evolve and awaken. And it also inspired kind of some of my creative projects. I have a YouTube channel where I talk a lot about all these different topics. But there's kind of a
Mm.
rambling, winding answer to your question there.
Sure, it's interesting. It's. I mean, it seems like your initial experience kind of was the turning point, as it is for many through direct experience. That, as you say, is very humbling. What was that? What was the substance that did that? If you can say that
Sure, yeah.
safely.
That was with psilocybin mushrooms.
Mm.
Yeah. So that
Mm.
was um, about 3.5 grams of dried psilocybin mushrooms.
Hmm. And I know several people are that have done that kind of substance. I would be very wary personally because I mean, what with my anxiety, the health, which is around health, anything that kind of messes with my senses, I don't like. I just don't like it, which is why I'm terrified of things like anesthesia as well.
Hmm.
Probably couldn't anyway because I'm on antidepressants, which again, something I'd love to get off eventually. And maybe this psychedelic research along with mental health would be a way forward for me, but I don't know. But anyway, I know that many people have had these experiences on psychedelics like psilocybin, like dimethyltryptamine, etc., who have had so-called negative trips or bad trips. What would you think then causes that kind of thing? And is what does that mean about the nature of the realms and the etc. That you have seen through your research in DMT and your own experience with psilocybin?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, let me preface the answer by just saying I'm certainly not a person who thinks that everyone should be taking these substances, right? I'm not I don't think we should be putting it in the water or anything like that. There are very important contraindications, right? And there are cases where people absolutely should not be taking any kind of psychedelic substance. But in the course of kind of doing, psychedelic assisted therapy, what becomes very rapidly clear is that there's an important difference between what we would characterize as kind of a bad trip versus a challenging trip, right? Just as a hypothetical example, if I went to a therapist, a talk therapist, and that therapist spent the entire session avoiding discussing any of the challenges, any of the points of pain, any of the uncomfortable emotions in my life, could we expect that therapy to be effective in any sense? If I went to a doctor and I had a physical wound and the doctor spent the entire time ignoring the physical wound, could that effectively create healing? No, clearly not, right? In the course of working towards healing and growth and transformation, it's very evident that if we spend all of our lives trying to insulate ourselves, to avoid, to numb, to distract, to bubble wrap our entire lives, that can, while that creates an increased sense of comfort, it doesn't necessarily create deeper transformation or healing, right? And so, yeah, I mean, everyone is different and unique, and this is painting with very broad strokes here, right? So everyone's process is unique. But in the course of, say, for example, there's someone who arrives on retreat who's been dealing with treatment-resistant depression. Maybe this is a person in their 50s or 60s who's been in therapy and tried lots of different antidepressants and lots of different modalities to try to address their depression. In the course of the psychedelic experience, it's likely that um, they may encounter challenging aspects or emotions, right? Because somehow that is key and central to the depression itself, right? Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to be said there. Psychedelics are what we could describe as abreactives, which means that within us that has an emotional charge kind of naturally comes to the surface. And kind of the clinical jargon or terminology is that psychedelics mobilize the unconscious, right? So very naturally in the course of a psychedelic experience, we might find we might find all types of memories or experiences just naturally, spontaneously bubbling up to the surface, going all the way back to early childhood, things we may have not have thought of or considered in decades, right? All of a sudden, I'm remembering this experience that I had on the playground when I was 3. And that's not just a cognitive process. There's often a powerful emotional charge there associated with that. right? And maybe that emotional charge is one that we subjectively appraise as negative. Maybe it's anger or rage. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's shame. Maybe it's grief. Maybe it's intense fear. Maybe it's terror, right? And so as that's coming up, I mean, hey, that's a challenging experience to sit with that. And yet, what we see again and again and again is that by creating a safe space for that experience to be held in a way that isn't overwhelming, right? So what's called the window of tolerance, right? Where there's kind of hyper arousal where it's just too much. I can't deal with all this energy, feels overwhelming, or hypoarousal, where we go into this kind of fold or freeze and just kind of shut down, right? We need to stay in this kind of window of tolerance. But even within this window of tolerance, it can be a challenging experience to visit um, fear, pain, anger, sadness, grief, guilt, shame, all these things. And yet, I'll say again, very reliably and repeatably, we see in any psychotherapeutic modality, in talk therapy, this is exactly what healing demands of us. This whole idea of feel it to heal it, right? And Joseph Campbell, who wrote this book about the hero's journey, or the hero with 10,000 faces, it's kind of this like academic, this mythologist who's a fascinating guy. He just studied myths and legends and lore from all around the world. And he has this quote that the cave we fear to enter might just have the treasure we seek. Because by kind of in a safe and measured way, in a responsible way, um, exposing ourselves to that pain allows us to transform and kind of evolve and transcend. No longer are we limited and oppressed by it.
Yeah, and I suppose to put it into more kind of colloquial day to day understanding sort of ways, something that I've always said and believed strongly is that quite simply, you learn a lot more and grow a lot more from negative experiences than you ever do from positive ones.
Right, right,
And I suppose
right.
that kind of
Yeah. So
encompasses the general idea.
yeah, and I mean, what we could describe as a bad psychedelic experience is really only occurs, I would say, in cases where these substances are being used irresponsibly, where I'm taking something without any psychotherapeutic support or any kind of facilitation. I'm all alone. Maybe I'm out in a public space. I'm wandering about and potentially putting myself or others inadvertently or advertently in harm's way, right? And if there's just some basic common sense safety protocols in place, which does include proper screening, because again, not everyone should be taking these substances. In these cases, challenging experiences are where the gold is at a lot of
Mm,
times.
mm. But as you say, it's different in terms of clinical use, I suppose, versus recreational use, because a lot of the negative experiences or the bad trips that you hear about are either, as you say, someone's taken it alone in a bad place and too much of it, or commonly as well, you see that whoever's with them at the time, is it sitter? I can't remember. Is kind of acting in a way that really should not be taking place while someone's in that vulnerable state, laughing and jeering at them, etc. Um, so I suppose therapeutically is a whole different area, and I don't know is there many cases of negative such trips during controlled psychedelic use in clinical settings, or is that more so just on the recreational use side?
Um, yeah, I think there's definitely a reasonably high incidence of experiences that people would characterize as psychologically challenging, for sure, or scary. But yeah, ideally, if there's a competent facilitator or trip sitter available, if there's adequate mind paid to preparation, to appropriate dosing of an appropriate substance, and to integration, ongoing support after the experience, then there is an extremely low incidence of enduring adverse outcomes. There's an extremely low incidence of any kind of lasting, um, challenging experience, and a very high incidence of positive outcomes.
And that's the important differentiation, isn't it? Rather than the experience itself being frightening or what one would consider negative in the time, is kind of secondary to the effects that that has. And as you say, overwhelmingly, just regardless of the positive or negative immediate experience, it shows that it more often than not, results in very positive long-term implications on one's lifestyle and beliefs
Yeah.
and general mental health well-being. So I suppose the question now then comes to the more physical one, in what's going on with these chemicals and what's causing these experiences. Most in the scientific community, I believe, would say it's effectively your brain is going insane. And I mean, more recently, we know about the effects of, I think is it psilocybin on the default mode network in the brain,
Yeah.
or ketamine maybe. I can't remember, but either way, I think the general mechanism is considered similar between all these chemicals. And the question is then, what does that mean? Because we know that the default mode network seems to decrease in activity, but not necessarily overall activity. It just in that region is less concentrated, which means the brain is effectively hyper-connected in
Yes.
different ways that it wouldn't normally be. So the question then becomes, is that an illusionary experience created by this hyper-connection, or is it a more ontologically spiritual experience that considers consciousness as a non-physical potential substance, not being the right word, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's a fascinating question. You're absolutely correct in your description of the default mode network. Um, that's attributed to the classical psychedelics. Psilocybin, ketamine works in a slightly different way. But yeah, there's a decrease in blood flow and activity to this structure largely in the prefrontal cortex, which assumes our sense of self and identity and kind of like our ontological worldview and our cognitive schema, the way that we interpret the world, and this sense of kind of like a skin encapsulated ego, right? All of that kind of dissolves and fades away at a certain dosage level in the psychedelic experience, which enables this quality of kind of lateral thinking and subjectively a sense of dramatically expanded um, realm of possibilities. And certainly that's some of what I was describing in my first psilocybin experience. You know, it's interesting. These substances are often called hallucinogens, suggesting that these experiences are hallucinatory or that they have no basis or grounding in um, reality and sort of objective consensus reality. I think that's a bit pejorative. I think it's a bit of a oversimplification of what can be a very complex thing, where we can almost imagine these experiences falling along a spectrum, right? Where some of these experiences, yes, absolutely, may be classified more as hallucinatory. Maybe I'm seeing, um, maybe in a sense, I'm kind of seeing something that isn't actually there. Maybe someone's walking past with red shoes and I'm seeing a red mouse there, right? Hallucinatory. Um, and at the same time, I think absolutely there are experiences which point towards a some sort of deeper truth or reality in a way that modern science in a physicalist or material reductionist perspective has yet to really acknowledge or contend with. And one analogy I would kind of use, is that psilocybin and some of these other psychedelics are almost like a tool, like a telescope. Just in the same way that we use a telescope to peer more deeply into the cosmos, or a microscope to peer more deeply into the fabric uh, of space-time, of matter. It's almost like psilocybin represents a lens or a tool for peering more deeply into our mind, into our unconscious mind, into consciousness itself, right? And if I'm peering through a telescope and I'm seeing more deeply into the cosmos in a way I can't see with my ordinary eyes. Is that a hallucination? No. We would qualify that more as an expanded perception, right? And amplified or enhanced perception. There's an author named Aldous Huxley who wrote about his psychedelic experience and that wrote this book called The Doors of Perception. And he kind of uses this analogy or this metaphor of under the influence of certain psychedelic substances, in some cases, doors of perception open, enabling an enhanced perception. Like the fidelity of our sense perception almost increases, where we can see what's here around us in a way that has increased sensitivity and increased acuity and increased validity, right? In indigenous uses of psychedelics, there are stories of people using psychedelics um, as a tool for hunting parties. They could, they were more attuned somehow to the natural environment, and they can more adeptly sense and identify when uh, the prey is in their vicinity, right? And of course, this works internally as well. So earlier, I was speaking to this idea of psychedelics mobilizing the unconscious of things coming up from earlier life, right? Sometimes we sort of recover memories of earlier life of an instance that I may have forgotten for the past 20, 30 years of my life. I was 2 years old when this happened. I don't consciously remember this happening. And yet somehow it seems to be registered or stored in the system because all of a sudden that memory comes up and I can almost re-experience the nuances of these memories, including details that can then be independently verified or validated for example, a parent who is there present at the time. Yes, of course, that did really happen. And suddenly this connects all these dots on why I have a very specific phobia or why why I kind of behaved in this way around this person or these types of people. This helps to explain why for years, like I've been struggling with this particular thing in my life, right? So that's just an example of how these substances are not always hallucinatory. In some cases, it's really better understood as they expand our perception, expand our awareness. Again, in some cases. And I would say, lastly, this also takes us to what we can understand or describe as transpersonal experiences, because the consciousness expansion doesn't just stop with our limited biographical story, with our life, right? There can be these transpersonal experiences, what many people call mystical experiences, where seemingly where our consciousness is expanding beyond the subjective limitations of this physical body and brain. And there's a sense of profound expansion and interconnection or unity with a greater reality, with life, with the universe, with the cosmos, with divinity, right? And what's fascinating is that all around the world and all throughout time, when a person has a mystical type experience, they're reporting and describing a very similar set of characteristics. Whether this is a spontaneous mystical experience that's, happened through just years of meditating or yoga or spiritual practice, whether there's a near-death experience, whether there's just like a spontaneous kind of out-of-body experience, or whether a person is taking a psychedelic substance. Very repeatedly and reliably, we hear people describing the same set of characteristics, where the subjective sense of like ego or the human identity dissolves away. There's a sense of expansion, of transcendence of space and time, of unity, of oneness, this noetic sense of truth and veracity, a sense of sacredness and bliss, a profound emotional, blissful or euphoric effect, and a direct encounter with a reality that is sensed to be divine, infinite, transcendent, eternal, the source. you know? So the question then becomes, if we have millions of people all throughout history and all throughout time who are having these experiences through a number of different means and all saying essentially, hey, look, there's a tree right there. And millions of people are all pointing and saying, yes, I see that tree and I'm describing that tree in that way. Are all of these millions of people hallucinating the same exact tree? Or could it be that in some way there's an expansion, there's an opening whereby there is an increased, a profoundly increased depth of insight and awareness into the fundamental nature of reality, again, in a way that is beyond a material reductionist conception of the nature of reality.
So you
Yeah.
mentioned that you would absolutely disagree on the lack of evidence for parapsychological phenomena. So let's get a little bit into that because that's an interesting one that is often often repeated um, belief that there has never been any reasonable, replicable evidence of parapsychological phenomena. So, what kind of things are there? Experiments that have been done? Because before we started recording, you mentioned briefly that there is, it seems to no longer be a matter of belief. It's now established as phenomena, as the phenomena existing. So, can we go into a little bit into that? Maybe what you've seen there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think just again kind of setting the stage with this notion of the hard problem of consciousness, right? That um it's just so ironic that every single one of us is conscious. We all intimately know consciousness. There's no experience of life without consciousness. And yet seemingly no one can agree on what is consciousness? What is the nature of consciousness is one of the biggest questions facing modern science today, right? And that really sets the stage for a consideration of parapsychological phenomenon because if we assume the position that there are a number of different theories as to the nature of consciousness and its relation with the physical brain, then a lot of these parapsychological phenomena suddenly become much more plausible. If I'm kind of locked into the position that uh, the brain produces or generates consciousness, then any idea of kind of extrasensory perception or an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience is just kind of immediately dismissed as hallucinatory or coincidence or chance. Right? But again, any honest scientist will admit that at the end of the day, no one knows. When it comes to specific evidence for parapsychological phenomena, I mean, it's a fascinating field because um, and by the way, it's also worth mentioning that it's funny to me that it's called parapsychology. It's almost in some ways pejorative, like pseudo-psychology or something like that. But really, there's a lot of amazing researchers out there that are diligently applying the scientific method to this field of research, and it was kind of started, to my understanding, by back in the early 1920s or 30s by a researcher at Duke University named J.B. Rhine, and he kind of started the first lab to scientifically and sort of rigorously investigate the possibility of telepathic phenomena. So he had these like Zener cards where, there's a set of 5 cards with symbols on them, and there's kind of a target card, and someone's supposed to identify it and mixed results, right? He found in some of his research statistically significant results. In others, there seemed to be more mixed results. A lot of criticism in later years about his research couldn't be replicated. But since that time, parapsychology has really exploded into this very lively field with a number of different kind of sub niches. I would say that, for me, in my eyes, some of the most compelling bodies of evidence within this whole field would be first research into near-death experiences, right? Which are surprisingly and increasingly common with the advancement of medical technology, more and more people being resuscitated and kind of brought back from cardiac arrest or after having crossed the clinical threshold of death. Millions of these cases, millions of these anecdotal reports from all around the world. This is a data set, and then there's more specific discussion around the analysis of the data. There's also um, a whole body of evidence around past life memories, and this is really kind of trailblazed and spearheaded at the University of Virginia here in the United States. They have a research unit or organization in the School of Psychiatry called the Division of Perceptual Studies, and this was started back in the 60s, where there was a man named Ian Stevenson who was kind of a very reputable psychiatrist at the time, and he was getting all these kind of anecdotal reports about young children who from the time that they can speak are describing all these like obscure and specific details around a previous lifetime that they had had, including but not limited to their name, their location where they lived, their job, their occupation, their spouse, specific family details, the manner of their death. So much so that this fascinated even Ian Stevenson because it inspired the idea of like maybe this, in some cases, there's enough information here where we can actually match this account to a real person who really lived and died. And Ian Stevenson spent the next, the rest of his career traveling the world, investigating this phenomenon. At the Division of Perceptual Studies right now, there are thousands. There are, I believe, off the top of my head, around 3,000 of these documented cases that have been carefully, rigorously documented, what they call solved cases, where a child is providing enough specific information that it can be this account can be confidently matched to a real person who really lived and died in the manner that the child describes. Where's the child getting this information from? If they're 3 years old, before he or she can read and write, where is this obscure and specific information coming from about the names of places and certain? It's a fascinating data set. It's more anecdotal, right? And there is statistical evidence as well. There's a wealth of statistical evidence. I would say two specific topics come to mind. One would be um, the subject of remote viewing. So there's a fascinating history around remote viewing, where the U.S. government, the CIA, was involved in this. Top Project Stargate, back during the Cold War. And Project Stargate, this was a secretive CIA investigation into the potential of psychic espionage using kind of developing a protocol for tapping into psychic abilities on demand in order to acquire intelligence about adversaries or about, whatever. And remarkable results have come out of this, right? I recently made a video on this topic. I can't remember the specific statistics off the top of my head, but there have been, this was a well-funded research effort, over $20 million over the span of more than 20 years. It was then replicated by different research institutions, notably at Princeton University, and thousands and thousands and thousands of these trials. The hit rate, so-called hit rate of the target, was way above what would be expected by chance. And, independent statistical analysis was kind of contracted to assess kind of like a meta study of a number of different specific studies into remote viewing. And, the odds are something obscenely low, like one in hundreds of trillions, that all of these kind of hits that were accumulated in all of these independent research efforts are all by chance, right? Something like
Would you be
Yeah,
like
yeah,
winning? Would you be like one person winning every lottery ever done, or something like that? Probably. I don't know.
yeah. Like something truly unimaginable. Like, you know, um, and so there is really is truly compelling evidence, statistical evidence for remote viewing, and much greater than the kind of threshold of evidence that we would assess for like the efficacy of a novel pharmaceutical drug, you know, that the effects are working, the chance that the effects are working um, by chance is, 1 in a million or whatever. That's an effect, that's a threshold by which we deem this drug is effective. Yeah, yes. And we have a much stronger statistical evidence for the efficacy, the reality of remote viewing. And you can just keep going on and on because there are lots of other bodies of research and data and evidence here. There's a really interesting research that was done by a man named Professor Daryl Bem, who wrote a very famous article about that's called "Feeling the Future" or something like this. And yeah, I can't necessarily describe all the nuances of this experiment in an accurate way, but I know that it's been repeated and replicated. And essentially, what it is that like the kind of research participant was prompted to, would have kind of um, be essentially on a computer screen or a TV screen, there would be kind of multiple options. There's one like closed doors. Behind one of these doors is the target image, and their task was to choose which door has the target image. And Ben found that if there was a image behind the door that had a strong emotional valence, one that was um, scary or that was kind of caused a disgust response, or he also found images that create that are sexually activating, sexually kind of explicit images. People would be able to choose those more consistently and reliably in a way that was well above chance. And what's interesting is that there was a random number generator which would randomly assign the image to a door, so to speak, behind one of the closed doors after the choice had already been made.
So it was almost
So it's almost like
acting
this person
temporally as
was
well. Yeah.
feeling the future
Mm.
in a way that's beyond way, statistically, like 1 in a billion, way outperforms um, um, chance, and this is a study that's been replicated. It's been replicated, and it's one of those studies that just kind of boggles the mind because it completely throws a monkey wrench in our understanding of the nature of space and time and kind of like the linearity of time.
Although that experiment also very famously has been criticised for its use of statistics or its method of statistical analysis, isn't it? I don't know the history of that, but I know of it.
Yeah, yeah, it has been, and he's also written responses to that, and there's been again, independent research efforts to assess. So there's all of this is to say that there's um, a lot of really interesting just kind of methodologies and research questions that are being studied, which clearly point to, at the very least, the limitations of our understanding of the nature of mind and consciousness, right? That there's more to the mystery of consciousness than anything that we currently understand at the bare minimum, right? Not to necessarily say that this is proof that the afterlife is real and that consciousness is infinite and transcendent and all that, but it presents a fundamental challenge to any kind of materialist conception of the nature of consciousness and the idea that physical matter is fundamental. And in particular, yeah, I mean, I find near death experiences and past life memories as some of the most just remarkable and compelling um, evidence.
See, I find it difficult, especially with near death experiences and some past lives. It's slightly different for past lives, but with near death experiences specifically, I struggle to find the evidential value outside of the sheer numbers of them for those that are purely subjective in nature. For someone that goes
Hmm.
out of their body, goes to this realm, sees their deceased loved ones who say, I'm fine, I love you, it's not your time yet. They meet Jesus or the Buddha or whoever else, and then come back. Because although for them individually, there's no doubt that this took place and it was real, and that's great. But in terms of a scientific kind of influence for the whole of our understanding of reality, it doesn't really offer much because it's not verifiable, it's not empirical, which is why
Hmm.
I generally look toward the those cases that include the phenomenon of veridical perception, which I'm sure you know about,
Sure. Yes.
and other people on the who's watching this should do because I've done enough bloody videos on them. Um, So, what do you think about the evidence surrounding veridical perception? Because many, and going back to Dr. Susan Blackmore, she's the most recent kind of skeptic I've seen. We discussed the book "The Self Does Not Die" by River Sturven and Smith, which include hundreds of cases of these verified perceptions and several others. And Dr. Blackmore said to me that all of the cases that she's seen of these can be very, very easily shown to have just been very sloppily researched or reported wrongly, etc. Which, I mean, I haven't read the full book. It's a
I
very
would
thick book,
strongly
but
disagree with
yeah,
that
so
claim.
that was my point. What do you think to that kind of analysis?
Yeah, I think it's pretty spot on. I think that veridical perception is absolutely probably the single most compelling uh, aspect of near-death experiences, this data set, when it comes to um, the nature of these experiences, that they're not just hallucinatory, that they're pointing to some deeper reality. I would I do think that there, in addition to veridical perception, there's also some really fascinating cases that are um, objective in nature. For example, we have uh, cases in which a person kind of crosses over during a near-death experience, cardiac arrest or whatever the case may be, crosses over to the other side, encounters a deceased relative, which the individual did not know
The
was dead at the
so-called
time of the
the
experience.
so-called Pekingarian experience,
Exactly.
which I always thought was a reference to the Bible, but I was corrected. It's some sort of poem or other. So I
Right.
correct myself on that. But yeah, the so-called Pekingarian
Yes,
experience.
exactly. Which also include and yeah, there are dozens of documented cases, right? And some people might say, well, it's just coincidence. But when it's repeated again and again, and these also include cases of siblings or relatives not known to have existed, right? So there are really interesting cases a uh, of a child who had a near-death experience. On the other side was greeted by, what he said was his twin sister or twin sibling, as well as another older sibling who his parents never told him existed, right? Because they didn't want to kind of cause any distress or shock to him.
Or was the result of a
It
miscarriage or a birth issue or something like that? Yeah.
exactly. That's I find that really compelling, and it has correspondence with objective reality, the kind of consensus physical reality. And as well, there are also cases of spontaneous healing. So people who have these near-death experiences, and I was reading one article somewhat recently of a person who had cerebral palsy, and he was in his 60s, and for the entirety of his life, one of his hands was kind of paralyzed, and he was unable to move his hand, right? For his entire life.
Was this
During this,
Sorry, was this one of Dr. Penny Sartori's cases from her study? Because there's one very similar to that.
Potentially,
Yeah.
potentially.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. And after this near death experience, there was this seemingly miraculous and inexplicable healing where he regained full motion after 60 years of being unable to move his hand. So just intriguing things happening here, and pointing to the concept that beyond veridical perception, there are other elements of near-death experiences which point to something deeper, as well as I would say the worldwide consistency of these reports and accounts that are kind of independently consistent or consistent, sorry, independent of sociocultural or religious background. But absolutely, to your point, I think that veridical perceptions, and there are amazing cases of veridical perceptions amongst blind people or people who have been blind since birth, who then have a near-death experience where they're able to then describe visual perceptions and visual descriptions of their body laying on the table and the room, their environment, during a time when they're unconscious or clinically dead, right? And I don't I think I personally I think that it's a bit of a cop out to attribute all of these accounts to sloppy research methodology. And there is such a wealth of these veridical perceptions. I mean, numbering in the hundreds at this point of carefully documented cases, that to really try to assert that every single one of them is chalked up to sloppy research, where we know there are very specific, thoroughly documented cases where minute by minute this person is hooked up to all kinds of medical equipment, including loud kind of clickers in the ear, blinding,
Mm-hmm.
eyes
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 shut.
being
Yeah.
blinded, things like this, where there is no way that this person should be able to ascertain what's happening in the room around them, much less a conversation that their loved ones are having a few miles away from the hospital, right? So again, it's for me, the conversation isn't about kind of picking apart any one particular case. It's about looking at the wealth of data and evidence and saying there is something here.
And not only within one discipline, discipline is probably the wrong term, but not just kind of conglomerating all the NDEs together, which is very important, but also conglomerating NDEs, remote viewing, past life memories, and everything in that phenomenology into one wealth of evidence, and pair
Yes.
that with the fact that we haven't got a clue what consciousness is, we haven't got a clue
Yes.
what 98% of the universe is consisting of. It doesn't seem unreasonable to me to assume that maybe the assumption that brain dies, consciousness dies, is incorrect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm personally convinced that this is the next great scientific revolution. Just in the same way that we realized that Earth is not at the center of this universe, eventually we're going to come to realize that physical matter isn't at the center of existence, and that there is way more. And again, this is what people from all around the world, the ancients, have told us for thousands of years. I mean, if we look back to all the great civilizations throughout history, the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, Indus Valley civilization, all around the world. I mean, these are the people who are responsible for creating the wonders of the ancient world. The pyramids aligned to the stars, aligned to the cardinal directions to within fractions of a single degree. I mean, masterful and almost incomprehensible levels of sophistication in engineering, math, technology, all these things. And yet, when it comes to the most important question, maybe the single most important question of what is the nature of soul or spirit or mind and the afterlife, supposedly, they're just making stuff up. They're just playing fantasy and make believe. And yet they're all agreeing.
I think the problem a lot of the time with with those ideas being ignored or considered wrong is kind of the way that we overlay our interpretations of, or more modern men interpretation of religion, because a lot of religious beliefs that people hold literally to me are, I don't want to sound pejorative, but I couldn't believe them because they just seem
Sure.
so unbelievable. Like believing, biblical literally, biblical. I can't remember, but when you literally believe what the Bible says, Noah's Ark, Adam and Eve, talking snake, the world being 6,000 years old, that sort of thing to me is inconceivable to be believable. And
Sure.
I think generally people seem to attribute that those beliefs are also kind of parallel to those of the very ancients, even before those times. Which obviously I think is a difficult comparison to make, because for the same reason that was before all of these texts arose.
I
And as you say,
yeah, I can
we can see the practicality of this race, even though they may have been less aware of the mechanics of the world around them. They clearly had some very impressive level of intelligence to be able to generate those structures. And I mean, my dad, for example, believes there was some kind of ancient alien involvement. I've never looked at that. I don't know. But certainly these ancients were a lot more sophisticated and a lot more intelligent than we seem to have believed for a long, long time. Maybe we're beginning to understand it a little bit more now. I don't know.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, what I think is worth pointing to is the ubiquity of there seems to be almost a universal agreement in every indigenous society, in virtually every single ancient civilization all around the world. Of course, there's an unbelievable diversity in specific cosmologies and beliefs, but universally, every single indigenous group um, is saying that there's more. There's more to the mystery beyond the physical, and there's more to what we are than this physical body. And is it not just the kind of the hubris of modern science to assume that we in the modern age know better? Because in plain and simple fact, we don't. Again, this is the hard problem of consciousness. And so yeah, I think there's the future evolution of human consciousness in some form or fashion requires an integration of ancient wisdom with um, modern information and knowledge, you know, because kind of bringing those together.
So I suppose to move slightly somewhat back to the science of the veridical perception and parapsychology, etc., some will argue that all the experiments that have been done specifically for near-death experiences, because that's what I'm most familiar with, the Parnia studies, Penny Sartori's studies, etc., that have had targets, nobody's ever seen them, which seems to invalidate the phenomena of the phenomenon. What would your response be to that?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a very important point and a very fair um, kind of criticism of anyone who claims that near-death experiences are evidence of the afterlife, of which I count myself among that group. Um, what I would say is that, you know, I think the research into this field is really just very much in its infancy. I think we're just not dealing with a great enough sample size. I mean, where there's a target put in a specific room, we know that um, in cases of a cardiac arrest, X percentage of people are reporting a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience, right? Which is a relatively low percentage. And so a lot of things have to line up very specifically, even for the individual who might hypothetically happen to have a near-death experience in that specific room with the specific target. It's still in some ways plausible that they're not occupied with the target that's with the image that's on the, shelf by the wall that they're kind of moving through into what subjectively feels like the afterlife realm. So it's just that a lot of very, very specific factors have to line up in order for there to be any kind of success with that specific research protocol. And at the same time, I would, if there was one success, that itself would be absolutely revolutionary. My kind of counter is that I think we're already in some senses looking at that very same phenomenon through some of these accounts of veridical perception, you know? This is a research methodology to essentially prove um, veridical perception, right? That these veridical perceptions are possible
beyond any scientific doubt, at least.
beyond any scientific doubt. Yeah. And at the same time, I can very much, imagine someone reading that study and then trying to say, well, it was a sloppy research design. Maybe this person had some kind of prior knowledge, blah, 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 blah. Because again, there already are these accounts of veridical perception, which are so compelling and so rigorously documented that I would say this is already demonstrating the very phenomenon which we're trying to prove by putting some picture on a shelf in a wall where maybe someone is going to experience cardiac arrest or have a near death out of body experience there. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree that certainly looking at the Parnia study, the most recent one, the Aware 2 study, we'll use that example because it's the most recent and the most known about. After everybody that was taking part, and I can't remember exactly how many it was, but it was a considerable amount. After everybody that took part, obviously unwillingly, the number of people who had an experience with an aspect of coming out of their body with perception that was potentially verifiable, who was well enough to be interviewed the first time, then well enough to be interviewed more in depth the second time, was one person. They didn't
Right.
see the target, but I think it was the same person or someone else that did have verified audible perception. Unfortunately, not under the scientific, conditions. But out of those thousands of participants in the study, we had a sample size of one who was well enough to be interviewed but didn't see the target. Now, to me, that's very far away from discrediting the phenomena as a whole, because
Yeah.
anybody in science will agree that one case is a terrible case to go off of to come to any conclusion. So it shows you
True.
how big these studies would have to be and how very, very, very carefully orchestrated to give the best possible chances of any kind of result is out of the realms of possibility, at least for now, until we can find a better way.
Well said. Yeah.
I would imagine you would also argue, as would I, that this is also the case in other phenomena as remote viewing, as out of body perception, not necessarily an NDE, but maybe willful out of body perception. In the case of Miss Z, or Miss Z, as you would say, from Charles Tart, as well as others, have also been demonstrated and yet don't seem to be taken seriously, despite them being notably, journaled, I suppose. So
Hmm.
why do you think that is? Because although we don't have a lab tested out of body experience from an NDE, we certainly seem to have verified experimental cases of remote viewing, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, it's a fascinating kind of sociocultural question. I mean, there's so many different elements to it. Um, Thomas Kuhn famously wrote this book, The History of the Scientific Revolution, right? This is the repeatable pattern that we've seen throughout the history of science again and again and again and again, is that there's an existing scientific ontological worldview, the kind of existing predominant consensus, right? Um, and a new idea is introduced that challenges the existing paradigm or the existing scientific consensus. It's ridiculed, dismissed, laughed at the building, out of the building, and jeered at, right? In some cases, punished, vilified. I mean, we saw this with Galileo saying that Earth isn't at the center of the universe, right? And another famous example is the scientists who introduced the idea of tectonic shift, the idea that Earth exists, the continents are these tectonic plates that move around. He was a professor that lost his job and lost his entire career because he was just ridiculed as to how outrageous this idea was. Then over time, slowly, there's such an accumulation of data and evidence that only it reaches a tipping point where only someone who is um, completely out of touch with reality could possibly, or someone who's completely irrational could possibly disagree with all of this data and evidence. And then there's this sea change where this new paradigm is adopted. But we see this again and again and again and again. This is the cycle. This is the means by which science advances, right? And we're seeing this very much again, where there's this accumulation of data and evidence, but it's still in this kind of phase of being, I wouldn't say as much being ridiculed or laughed at or kind of jeered, but very much being dismissed and discredited. Where yeah, so I mean, I think
It's just a matter of science psychology, really, isn't it? Human
there's
psychology.
there's this very repeatable historical pattern that's playing itself out again in this case when it comes to novel theories of the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality, and as well, in modern science, I mean, science is very well equipped to deal with things that are measurable, right? Things that are measurable, quantifiable. Human subjective experience is subjective. It's not measurable. So modern science is ill-equipped to really deal with and account for experience, human experience. And in the case of near-death experiences, for example, we're dealing with, yes, this is anecdotal data, but we're dealing with such a wealth, like hundreds of thousands of cases with hundreds of millions of cases estimated globally. Something like 5% of the population will experience this at some point in their lives. That's hundreds of millions of people across the world. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
With a phenomena that is certainly underreported.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we have all of this kind of this wealth of human experience, and yet from the kind of the tools of modern science say that's experiential. I can't measure that. I can't quantify that. And therefore, it's subject to just it's hallucination. It's subject to easily being waived or dismissed. So yeah, um, I think over time we will see a further accumulation of data and evidence to the point where there will be some sort of tipping point, and it's very hard to imagine what that is because for someone who reads through some of these articles and cases and data and evidence, I mean, there's already such a wealth of data. I mean, mountains of data and evidence suggesting again, at bare minimum, that there's more to the mystery of consciousness than a physical brain. And yet it's overlooked.
So I suppose one last thing I'd like to get your opinion on regarding the kind of more skeptical approach is something that I see probably more often as a rebuttal than anything else for anything like remote viewing, evidential mediumship, past life memories, out of body perceptions, and you'll know exactly where I'm going with it, James Randi.
Hmm.
Why haven't any of these people that can do this and have been experimented on, why haven't they ever gone and claimed the Randi challenge in public? Where clearly that would then be accepted. That's the question that I hear and see a lot. What do you
hmm
think on
hmm
that?
Um, it's a good question. It's a fair question. I don't know enough about the specific history of this to really adequately answer that because even just recently, I mean, I've seen headlines that or not headlines, but like it's like an article that says like I submitted proof for data to James Randi and there's no resp I mean, I'm wondering if that is really like a fair standard to evaluate this data on because I don't know anything about James Randi at this point in the present day. Is he still,
He's no, he's
is
passed.
this,
Unfortunately, he passed the challenge. I think was shut down eventually. I don't know much about it myself either, which is why I always ask it because it's very interesting. Because
right, right.
intuitively, it seems fair. Why wouldn't anyone have passed this challenge?
Interestingly enough, there was recently, and you might be aware of this. There was a an individual named Robert Bigelow who
Mhm.
started a um,
An essay
he so
competition, isn't
happened
it? Hmm.
yeah, he so happens to be a very successful businessman who started what's called the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies that kind of launched this essay contest that awarded a lot of money, like
It was
over a million
half a
dollars.
million. It was half a million to the winner, and then something else, and it was
Yeah,
Jeffrey Mishlove that won it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And Pim van Lommel, who's like a very well-known near-death researcher, I think claimed the second prize. But over $1 million in prize money was awarded for the prompt was write an essay that presents the most compelling scientific evidence for the survival of consciousness beyond death, beyond physical death, and received, hundreds of applicants from all around the world. And um, the kind of the threshold of the way that the evidence was weighed was kind of like beyond a reasonable doubt, like almost using the rule of a court of law, for example. And yeah, so there are hundreds of these essays, and dozens of them. All of the essay winners are live right now
And they're free to view, aren't
on the
they?
Bix. Yeah, they're free to view. They're free to download on the Bix website. And um, I would say any one of the top winners is providing incontrovertible evidence, incontrovertible, scientifically founded, grounded, analytical, thoughtful, rational evidence that there is more to the mystery of consciousness. And I don't know. I would love if James Randi was still alive, if he could read some of those.
Yeah,
Um,
it'd be interesting to hear his take on it.